Lemuel Gulliver was born into the family of a poor English landowner. The boy was the third of 5 sons. At the age of 14, he became an apprentice to a famous London doctor, and then got a job as a surgeon on a ship.
Cool.
For 6 years Gulliver traveled to different countries, observed the customs of the natives, and even studied their language. And so Gulliver set off on another voyage on the ship Antelope. But did not have time to pass even halfway, as the ship fell into a terrible storm. The storm hit the ship against the rocks, and the sailors jumped overboard in horror. And only Gulliver managed to get into the boat. He was carried for hours on the waves, and soon by a miracle the boat washed ashore. But Gulliver was so exhausted by the storm that as soon as he stepped on the ground, he immediately fell asleep on the nearby lawn. The rays of the first sun awakened Gulliver.
Oh, no!
He tried to get up, but realized that he could not move. His arms, legs, and even his hair were tied to the ground with a net of small ropes. Suddenly something tickled Gulliver's chest. He raised his head and saw a little man the size of a finger. It was the king of the Lilliputians. He gave the order, and then thousands of small arrows, like needles, began to stab Gulliver's body. The prisoner immediately realized that it was better to submit. He showed by signs that he was hungry and thirsty. Then, by order of the king, food was brought to him. More than 100 natives climbed the stairs to Gulliver's mouth, pouring baskets of fruit, bread, and meat on him. When Gulliver ate everything, he was taken to the capital on a specially made platform. The prisoner was placed in a huge temple, chained to his left leg with many miniature chains. It was the largest room in the entire country, but even into it the giant had to walk on all fours. At a meeting of the Lilliputians, the king ordered to provide Gulliver with a staff of 600 servants. They sewed a suit for the prisoner and even a bedding for miniature mattresses.
Nice.
And over time, the king was convinced that the giant is kind and therefore released him. Gulliver traveled a lot around the country, studied the customs and language of the Lilliputians, and even participated in their holidays and parades. Once, while communicating with the king, Gulliver learned that Lilliputia was at war with the empire of Blefuscu, located on a neighboring island. The reason for the contention was that the Lilliputians could not agree with the Blefuscans on how to properly break the eggs. The Lilliputians split them from the sharp end, and the Blefuscans from the blunt. And now rumors reached the king of Lilliput that the enemy had prepared a fleet and was about to attack. Then the emperor asked for help from Gulliver, and he willingly agreed. And so, under cover of night, Gulliver took long ropes and swam to the enemy ships. He tied a rope to each ship and dragged them to the shores of Lilliput. The guards, who were the only ones on the ship, jumped into the sea and started swimming away from the giant. So Gulliver completely disarmed the opponents and received the most honorable title in the kingdom for this. For this, the courtiers disliked Gulliver. They began to weave intrigues against him, and soon the king himself accused the giant of high treason. Rumors spread throughout the kingdom. And Gulliver learned that at the Privy Council, it was decided to execute him.
Oh no!
Therefore, that very night, Gulliver made his way to the shore, where he left his broken boat. Having quickly repaired the boat, the giant left the country of the Lilliputians in a hurry, taking with him 6 small live cows, 2 bulls, and the same number of sheep and rams. Gulliver sailed on the ocean for a long time until he noticed an English ship.
Yeah!
On it, he safely got home. But, as it turned out, this was just the beginning of Gulliver's adventures. Doomed by fate to lead a hectic life, Lemuel Gulliver again set off on a voyage on the adventure ship 2 months after returning home. But as soon as the ship passed the Strait of Madagascar, a storm overtook it. Strong gusts of wind carried the ship to an unknown land. When the sailors saw the land, they decided to inspect it and collect fresh water. Gulliver went down to the shore with the sailors, and the crew scattered across the island. Not finding water, Gulliver decided to return to the shore. But as soon as he approached the ocean, he saw that the sailors had abandoned him. They were sailing away in full sail from the huge giant who was chasing them. Frightened, Gulliver rushed into the interior of the island. He ran to a barley field with huge ears and realized that he was in the land of giants. Gulliver sat down to rest. But before he had time to catch his breath, he noticed a huge foot that was about to step on him. Gulliver started screaming as loudly as he could. And the giant noticed him. He lifted Gulliver with his hand, examined him intently, and carried the little man to the owner farmer. The farmer tried to speak to Gulliver, but his voice was so loud that it deafened the little man. Then the owner brought Gulliver home. At the house, the farmer's family was preparing for dinner. The little man was seated on a table where gigantic pieces of beef and bread lay. But before Gulliver had time to break off his bread, the farmer's son grabbed it upside down and began to shake it. He mistook Gulliver for a toy and tried to put it in his mouth. Then the father loudly threatened his son and asked him to treat the little man more carefully. Later, the farmer's 9-year-old daughter made a bed for Gulliver, sewed clothes for him, and even taught him the language of the giants. The girl gave Gulliver the name Grildrig, which meant dwarf. He called her a nanny. Gulliver aroused great interest among other giants, so the farmer began to show him at fairs for money. But frequent performances undermined Gulliver's health. Then the farmer happily sold the little man to the queen. So Gulliver moved to the palace and became the darling of the royal family. However, the court dwarf, who was no longer considered the smallest man in the kingdom, disliked Gulliver and ruined his life in every possible way. Once, when Gulliver was strolling through the garden, the dwarf began to cower the apple tree. And Gulliver had to escape from the falling giant apples.
Oh no!
And on another occasion, an agile dwarf pushed Gulliver into a huge jug of cream. And only the cook, who entered on time, saved the little man from inevitable death. But it wasn't just because of the dwarf that Gulliver got into trouble. So one morning during breakfast he was grabbed by the cook monkey. Like a cub, she began to rock Gulliver and then dragged him to the roof. The giants rushed to save the little man. And as soon as they climbed onto the roof, the monkey threw Gulliver off. Fortunately, he managed to catch onto the shingles and was safely rescued. In general, Gulliver's life in the kingdom was happy. He often accompanied the queen on her travels. They even made a special travel box for him. And once on another such trip, the servant brought the box with Gulliver out to the sea so that the little man could enjoy the fresh air. But then a shadow began to flicker over Gulliver's head. A sea eagle flying past noticed prey in a box. He grabbed the ring on the lid of the chest with his beak and carried Gulliver over the ocean. At some point, the bird released the box, and the captive found himself in the open sea. Gulliver barely managed to open the top hatch. He started shouting and waving his handkerchief. Finally, he was spotted from the ship and helped to get out. So, after all the adventures, Gulliver returned to England again. For a long time, he could not get used to objects and people of normal size. And Gulliver's wife, frightened that he had gone mad, strictly forbade her husband to think about traveling. Not having stayed at home for a week, Lemuel Gulliver set off on another trip on the ship Good Hope. But after a few days, the ship was overtaken by the pirates. They hijacked the ship and tied up the entire crew. Gulliver tried to escape, so as punishment, the pirates dropped him in a boat to the will of the waves and winds.
Oh no!
For a long time Gulliver circled the open ocean until he noticed land on the horizon. He swam to the shore and began to survey the land.
What?
Suddenly a huge shadow covered the sun. Raising his head, the astonished Gulliver saw a large island soaring in the sky. Exhausted by hunger and thirst, Gulliver began to scream, waving his hat, hoping that the inhabitants of the island would notice him. Then the natives took pity on Gulliver and lowered the stairs, so that he could climb the island. When Gulliver climbed the stairs, he found a crowd of very strange locals in front of him. Their heads were tilted to the right or left, with one eye looking inward and the other upward. And at each noble person there was a servant who patted the owner on the lips or ears, distracting him from his thoughts. Gulliver received a warm welcome. He was fed in the palace and even had a tour of the island. So, Gulliver realized that the earth soars in the sky due to a huge magnet, and at the base there is a giant diamond.
Okay.
But life in the Flying Kingdom was boring, so Gulliver soon returned to Earth. Before his eyes was a devastated country where local residents, dressed in rags, were starving. As it turned out, these people did everything in their lives the other way around. They built a house starting from the roof. They tried to get the sun's rays from cucumbers.
What?
And the artists were blindly mixing paint for paintings. Local scientists did not understand why words are needed in a language. After all, to everyone who began to argue, they simply cut out the brains and swapped them. Gulliver's surprise knew no bounds, and he hastened to leave the island. Going to neighboring lands, Gulliver found himself in the kingdom of darkness and gloom. Trembling with fear, he continued his journey. Suddenly a ghost appeared from the darkness. In fright, Gulliver tried to hide, but the spirit noticed him. He beckoned the traveler with a gesture, and Gulliver had no choice but to follow the ghost. Very soon they reached a large castle, and Gulliver was invited to a reception with the king. Walking through the castle, Gulliver saw hundreds of ghosts who cooked dinner, cleaned and guarded the chambers. It turned out that this country is ruled by a powerful sorcerer who can raise the dead. And all the living dead serve him. The wizard received Gulliver with honors. And to entertain such a rare guest, he began to revive anyone whom Gulliver asked. They were great warriors, sages, and even primitive people. But tired of wandering, Gulliver thanked the wizard and soon left the kingdom of darkness. He went to the nearest port, where he hoped to board a ship bound for England. Walking around the port, Gulliver immediately attracted attention. A foreigner in such places was a rarity, and therefore Gulliver was mistaken for a spy, seized and urgently taken to the local ruler. The foreigner was immediately found guilty. And as punishment, Gulliver had to crawl across the throne room on his stomach, licking the floor in his path. This was the custom. At the end, Gulliver bowed to the monarch 7 times, hitting his head on the floor. Then the governor looked thoughtfully at Gulliver, and then pardoned him. Miraculously freed, Gulliver ran out of the castle, and went to the nearest port, where he boarded an English ship. I must say that Gulliver never returned to these parts. Lemuel Gulliver spent 5 whole months with his wife and children in England, but the craving for travel turned out to be stronger. So, having become the captain of the adventurer ship, Gulliver set off on another voyage. He recruited 50 crew members, but as it turned out, not all of the crew were honest people. Once, under cover of night, traitors rioted a ship, broke into Gulliver's cabin, and tied him up. For 3 days the crew kept the former captain locked up. And on the 4th day, the traitors landed Gulliver on an unknown land, left him some provisions and sailed north. The former captain had no choice but to head inland. On the way, he met the tracks of horses, which gave Gulliver hope for an early rescue. Suddenly a humanoid figure appeared on the horizon. Gulliver narrowed his eyes and saw her. It was a strange-looking monkey with dark skin and curly hair. These animals had long claws on their paws. They looked so dangerous that Gulliver held his breath and leaned against the tree behind. But then something grabbed the traveler's shoulders and pulled him up. These were 2 exactly the same monkeys who tried to drag their prey up the tree. Gulliver struggled to fight back with his hands, but the animals were stronger. While Gulliver fought in an unequal battle, the sound of hooves was heard. Noticing the approaching horse, the monkeys threw Gulliver and ran away in terror. Having approached, the horse examined Gulliver with interest. Then a second horse came up. They greeted each other with a kick of their front hooves and walked to the side. The horses behaved so intelligently that it seemed to Gulliver that they were wizards who turned into horses. Finally, after consulting, the horses ordered Gulliver to follow them. This time, Gulliver ended up in a country inhabited by intelligent horses, the Gims. And the strange monkeys who attacked Gulliver served the Gims as pets and did all the dirty work. So the traveler was brought to a house where a manger with hay stretched along the wall and other horses were stationed. The horse gestured to Gulliver to eat some hay, but the traveler noticed a bucket of milk and asked for a drink from it. After dinner, Gulliver, under the close supervision of horses, collected oats and baked bread from it. This amazed the Gims so much that they began to teach Gulliver their language and culture. The horses turned out to be not only intelligent, but also very noble. They did not know the words anger, envy, deception, and enmity. They were surprised by Gulliver's stories about money, ships, and states. But most of all, the Gims were outraged by the fact that people allow themselves to ride horses. Over time, Gulliver became so imbued with love and respect for the Gims that he decided never to return to people again. However, every fourth year, a council of representatives was convened in the country, where they discussed the main state of affairs. Gulliver, as an ape-like creature, was not allowed to be present at the meeting. However, out of curiosity, he secretly entered the meeting, hiding in a haystack. It turned out that the Gims had long considered the strange monkeys useless, and therefore decided to drive them out. And Gulliver with them.
Oh, no!
Without waiting for his fate, the traveler hastily made a boat and went to the nearest island. Gulliver decided to spend the rest of his life away from people who were nasty to him. However, the island turned out to be the coast of Australia. Gulliver was seen by sailors from a Portuguese ship and taken to the ship. The captain decided that Gulliver has lost his mind, so he does not want to return home and tells his tales about intelligent horses. When Gulliver was brought to London, he learned to bear the sight of people with great difficulty. He got used to his wife and children only after a year, but even then he did not allow himself to be touched.
No.
And for the rest of his life, Gulliver communicated only with the stallions he bought.